The Great American Read just shared with us some of their favorite monsters and villains, but that's not all there are. We've got a lot more to talk about, and we're inviting you to stay tuned and watch cover to cover, but we're warning you, make sure you keep the lights on, because it's time now for our picks. Hello, I'm Ernie Manouse, and welcome to Cover to Cover. We are taking a look at some of our favorite books dealing with villains and monsters. And we're interested in what you think, too. On Twitter, you can join the conversation at #Cover2Cover and tell us what you think. But you know what? Outside of the folks at home, we've got the folks right here with us. And I'd like to introduce to you some of my favorite villains and villainesses. We're going to start. You know her from the films Space Cowboy and Leap of Faith. She's an iconic Houston actress. Deborah Hope is here with us. Hello, Deborah.
Hello.
He is a former retired sergeant and the head of Houston Cosplay for Charity, Ivo Gambino. Welcome, Ivo.
Thank you.
Another actress who knows her way around a wicked role. She's done Ursula and a million others. Welcome, Christina Stroop, to the show. And we're honored to have Houston's Poet Laureate with us. We are thrilled, Deborah Mouton. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
Okay, we're talking about villains and monsters and your deepest desires. Deborah Hope, what is your deepest desire?
Control.
Control? What do you think motivates a good villain, Ivo?
I'm pretty sure being evil.
Being evil is what, though? Because I think most evil characters, I'm going to toss this to you, Christina.
Yeah.
Most evil villains think they are being good, don't they?
Yes. Well, I think a lot of it stems from the fact that most villains are misunderstood. That's what I think. Obviously because I play them a lot, so maybe that's me making an excuse for myself. But no, I feel like a lot of times a person starts out innately good, and then things happen to them in their life that makes them think that being evil is good. And so they've eventually convinced themselves that what they're doing is for greater good in their own perception of being a villain.
So I'm going to say Deborah again. We're going to get confused with so many Deborahs here today. So Deborah, when we look at flawed characters, almost all great characters have a flaw.
Absolutely.
What is it that drives and switches one over to the dark side as opposed to the light?
I think it's a need to be heard and to be understood, very much as was said before. I think that kind of when you get in this space where you feel like you've been silenced and no one will listen to you when you've gone about everything the right way, then there has to be another way to proceed, right? And so sometimes that has to be a little bit darker.
Yeah. What do we think about villains in general? Who are some of our favorite villains?
The one I'm talking about is, I have a couple, Richard III. I go to Shakespeare because I'm a Shakespeare geek.
Shakespeare had a great grasp on
Yes.
villains. Who else had a really good grasp on villains? Who, from an author point of view, do you think really got? What about Disney?
Oh, yeah.
Oh my gosh,
Oh,
yes.
100%.
Now, in the most cases, Disney and their people didn't write these stories.
No.
They reinterpreted them and
Adapted
brought
them.
them to the. But they have a way with a villain. What works with that?
I just think that they understand the whole pathos of writing, where it's like, take Lion King, okay, which is one of my favorites.
Yeah, I was gonna go
You
there.
have Scar and you have Mufasa, and it all stems, and it can come from biblical stories, Cain and Abel. It's the same kind of concept where you have the good
Light and
brother,
dark.
the lightness and the darkness, and the brother that was ignored and was not good enough because of the parenting and how that went along. And then you see where they go. Scar has his hyenas, Mufasa has his tribe, and they deal with the cards that they're dealt with, and they live what they think is the best for everyone.
Okay, my problem in what you're talking about, not in what you said, but I always have this trouble when I'm looking at Lion King and a lot of Disney. Eva, why right before the climax do they always give away their whole plan? Why do the evil characters always have to show you all the cards?
Because they think they've already won and that you can't do anything to stop them.
But isn't that their big flaw?
Yes.
Oftentimes, it gives them a
The
moment
ego.
for, it's the ego.
They
It's
wanna
the
be
ego,
heard.
The downfall
Yes.
is always the ego.
So what separates then, if we've got ego, what separates monster from villain?
I think a monster is pure evil and knows that he's evil. I think a villain is someone who's doing something for the greater good of him or herself, or the greater good of his or her people.
I agree with that.
I agree with that. I think it's also why we've started to get villains that have much more complex backstories. When we get into books and into movies now, the interpretations, right? The new Avengers movie, that was the rage, was the fact that we have a villain that could be understood and could be relatable. And there was something about that you could see the humanity in them, even if you didn't agree
Can
with
you
their
be a
actions.
villain in one time and not in another time?
Yes.
Because
Yes,
circumstances
absolutely.
change around you.
Absolutely.
Who are some that we've seen? Anyone come to mind for anyone?
There's one, I want to say that, and it's crazy, Deadpool, I think is such a good example of someone
She
who...
turns to our cosplayer on the panel for that one.
Our cosplayer. Someone who does very bad things at the wrong time or the right time, or does very good things at the wrong time or the right time. It's not one or the other. It's like we all are. It's blended.
I'm curious, have villains become more complex, or are we just discovering characters that have become more complex as we read?
I think that it's an adaptation, right? In the books versions, I think that they've always had this very complex nature that hasn't always translated to film and to other mediums just because of time. And so I think that now people are starting to figure out, how do we take all of those layers that an author puts in, or that whoever the writer is, how do we incorporate actually exposing all of those layers to a new audience? I think that that's much more of what it is than it never existing before.
Yeah.
And with technology as well,
Yeah.
it's people can get a hold of this text easily. They can find these things, they can interpret things, and I think now with the internet and everything we have going on with social media and all of that, it just makes it all very accessible, and people can talk about it openly at any time that they want.
Yeah.
Is it harder to write a good villain today? I'll throw this to you.
Yeah.
Considering what we've seen in the world happening to people in general. Is being more outrageous on the page and in fiction harder the more outrageous we as a species become?
I don't think it becomes harder. I actually think it becomes more relatable because it's things that you see every day. Instead of the villain being this outcast of and hated, it can be someone's favorite character, right? Killmonger from Black Panther was a lot of people's favorite character,
Yeah.
right? And it was because they were able to see kind of where the motivations came from a very real world perspective. And so I think the more we see kind of the real life villain characters play out in our society, the easier it is for us to find this very relatable trend and transition to the villains in the books that we read.
And you do root for them to be redeemable.
Absolutely.
You do root for that. You know why they're doing what they're doing. You understand. You think, I could have done that too, how bad that is. But you're rooting for them to get to the moral high ground. You want them to do, and they don't do it. You're like, well, that's
Okay,
the consequence.
classic villain that doesn't work for you. Who's the villain? Everyone's like, oh, that's the, and you're like, I don't get it. They don't seem so bad to me.
Oh, that's a good question.
Wow, that's a really good question.
That is, I don't
And
know.
it's really great dead air, too. I think. That's a good answer to that really great question.
I think Dr. Frankenstein, I think what you're
Yeah.
talking about, that is a,
Because he thought he was doing something for the greater good.
and you
creating
feel
this.
sorry for him the whole time he's doing something
Well, that
wrong.
takes me back to the villain monster question. For my separation, monsters almost seem as though they are misunderstood, where villains are up to no good. Could that be a definition?
See, and I kind of see it the opposite
I do
way.
too.
I
do
think in
too.
the creation of a monster, like their sole purpose was to be, the antagonist and to be so polarized in that position that they're there only for the opposition.
But don't
But
we?
controlled.
Yes,
But don't
absolutely.
we label a monster and a villain labels themselves?
I mean, I think that's a great question because even if you look at a book like Monster by Walter Dean Myers, right, the name is Monster, you find a really hard time trying to find who the villain in the book is and who the monster in the book is. I think that is a very up to people's interpretation.
Well, look at Caliban
Yeah.
from The Tempest, who is misshapen and he's evil and he's bad, but you hear his backstory and you feel sorry for him. But he's physically monstrous and he's villainous. So
And so maybe there's something in the physicality, right? I think that
Maybe,
we think of monsters as being
Ugly.
kind of deformed and ugly.
Like your
and
soul.
Absolutely, this outward display of this like oversized need to have id and ego portrayed, whereas a villain we think of as being almost like human, right? And just a flawed version of that humanity.
So, what are some of your favorite monsters and villains? Join in the conversation, #cover to cover. We want to know what you think, but we also want to know what you folks think. So, Deborah, who is your monster or villain?
So my favorite monster or villain is Annie from Misery, by Stephen King.
Yeah.
I love Stephen King, right? The Stephen King universe is brilliant. I love how all of the pieces play together. But for some reason, I don't know if it's her love of literature or her like the ends that she goes to it that kind of just provoke me and have always stood out with me. And so she's just been the thing for me. Her misguided nature to kind of want this book to be better and better and the story to be told more and more in depth and it never being enough is so beautiful to me. So I guess that she would be kind of like the villain that I lean towards.
Okay, let's hear a little of that villainous passage.
So this is from a section when they're kind of already in the home. He's kind of been taken away. He says, "Annie, are you all right?" "No," she said indifferently and turned around. She looked at him with the same dullard's expression as she pinched her lower lip between her thumb and her first finger of her right hand. She pulled it out and then twisted it, pinching inward at the same time. Blood first welled up lip and then gushed down her chin. She turned and left without speaking a word. Before his stunned mind could persuade itself that he had really seen her do that, she closed the door and locked it. He heard her thud slushing her way down the hall to the parlor. He heard the creak of her favorite chair and she sat down. Nothing else. No TV. No singing, no clink clink of silver or crockery. No, she was just sitting there, being not all right.
Right? Stephen King does have a way with painting those pictures for you.
Yes.
Now it's interesting because I noticed the language when you're reading that. And I'm going to go over Deborah Hope because I know your author has a way with words too.
Yeah, a little bit.
What did you pick?
Shakespeare's Macbeth. Lady Macbeth is probably my go-to villain. She can, first of all, she could be played at any age. So she could be a trophy wife. They could be the same age. They could be an older couple where she's been waiting for him to finally get what she thinks they deserve.
When you read it, how do you see her?
Well, of course, when I was younger, I saw her as a young woman, and now I see her as an older woman. So
you always see her as you.
Isn't that funny?
Houston cast her.
Isn't that funny?
Her agent.
My agent need to cast me in this? Yeah. So she is, and the passage that I'm going to read is when they have already made their plan to kill the king in their castle, and they're having a
Spoiler
dinner.
alert.
Spoiler alert. And Macbeth decides that he's freaking out and he can't do it, and he leaves the table. And she's the hostess, and she has to leave the king at the table and go into him to say, "What is wrong with you?" And he's saying, "I don't think I can do it." And she's saying, what are you talking about? But he says, "What if we fail?" And she goes after him and she says, "We fail, but screw your courage to the sticking place and will not fail. When Duncan is asleep, whereto the rather shall his day's hard journey soundly invite him. His two chamberlains will I with wine and wassail so convince that memory, the warder of the brain, shall be a fume, and the receipt of reason a limbeck only. When in swinish sleep their drenched natures lie as in a death, what cannot you and I perform upon the unguarded Duncan? What not put upon his spongy officers, who shall bear the guilt of our great quill?"
Give her a Tony.
Well, that's what you get when an actress reads a book.
And the very next line that he said, and there's a big pause, and he's just like, "Bring forth men, children only." You are quite a woman, and convinces him that she's going to do it. I love her. But then she goes crazy and kills herself.
Another spoiler alert. Taking us to the other side of the spectrum. Okay, Ivo, what have you picked for us?
I've picked How the Grinch Stole Christmas.
The
because
Grinch, a great character.
The Grinch, to me, he's misunderstood like a lot of villains or monsters. And the passage I picked, I'm going to read it to you. It shows just how canny and quick-witted villains could be and should be. Then he got an idea, an awful idea. The Grinch got a wonderful, awful idea. "I know just what to do," the Grinch laughed in his throat. And he made quick Santa Claus hat and coat, and he chuckled and clucked. "What a great Grinchy trick. With this coat and this hat, I look just like Saint Nick. All I need is a reindeer." The Grinch looked around, but since reindeer are scarce, there was none to be found. Did that stop the Grinch? No. The Grinch simply said, "If I can't find a reindeer, I'll make one instead." So he called his dog Max. Then he took some red thread and tied a big old horn on top of his head. And to me, that is the Grinch making do with what he can, because not all villains have every resource available to them. So they devise a plan to beat you with what they have around you.
Good
or
call.
them.
Now I do wonder though, listening to that, and I'm curious all your opinions before we get your book, is if a villain is redeemed during the work, are they still a villain, or do we not classify them as such? Like Ebenezer Scrooge, is he a villain because at the end he is redeemed?
Right.
They have a new class called anti-hero,
Yes, I was going to say the same
Anti-hero.
thing.
which is Deadpool is very well known as.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Now we're on to our last read.
Oh,
Okay.
no
Chrissy?
pressure.
No pressure. Give us
Here
a
I
good
am.
one.
Oh, well, here we are. I decided to do Frankenstein not only because it's a classic, but I think actually it falls very well with what we spoke of between the classification of a monster versus a villain. And I feel like people perceive this book in so many different ways based on how they read it. Because in my opinion, Frankenstein, the monster that Victor created, is the monster, but only became a monster when he started learning from humans.
Which goes
And
back to
became-
my earlier question
Yeah,
about,
exactly.
do we
Yeah, and he
create the
became
monster?
more human because he was shown hate and unkindness because of his appearance, and he wouldn't have known any different had he not encountered any human interaction. So that's why I chose it. I think it's a very interesting story, and people perceive it so differently and will argue about it.
And it's very different than most movie interpretations.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Give us a little taste. of it.
Sure. Even broken in spirit as he is, no one can feel more deeply than he does the beauties of nature, the starry sky, the sea, and every sight afforded by these wonderful regions seems still to have the power of elevating his soul from earth. Such a man has a double existence. He may suffer misery and be overwhelmed by disappointments, yet when he is retired into himself, he will be like a celestial spirit that has a halo around him, within whose circle no grief or folly ventures.
Oh, that makes you feel sorry for
Question
him.
that comes to
Right.
mind hearing you read that too. Is it a shame when a monster or a villain character goes into popular culture to the extent that something like Frankenstein does, that we forget about the source material, that we have a concept and yet you need to go back to these?
Because the story's so different than what they know, because he tries to create another monster in this,
Right.
and the monster leaves, the Frankenstein monster leaves. So it's just it's so interesting to me how in popular culture, all of these things get just watered down based on like films. Like people see Young Frankenstein, which is now a popular musical. And plug for myself.
Hello, agents.
Hi, I would like to be in that. No, but it gets so watered down. And even though I love Mel Brooks, I love everything he does, but people think that is the story of Frankenstein, but it's not, and we have so many things. Dracula is another one, another
Yeah.
classic one that has been watered down to so many different levels. And then you have all these like vampire stories, and it's all different from what we started with, with Bram
But
Stoker's.
having said that, I don't mind when they adapt stories.
Yeah,
And
of
I brought
course.
this other book by Joe Nesbo. He's a Dane, I believe. Anyway, from around that region. And he wrote a Macbeth, and he retold the story. And even Shakespeare took that story from another story. He didn't just make it up. And Macbeth was a real person, but he wasn't evil. So he also adapted the story. Joe Nesbo adapts it and sets it in 1970 and makes it a noir crime drug novel. So the witch, Hecate, who is the queen of the witches, is now a man, and he's the drug lord.
Okay,
And
are we
Macbeth-
all
so-
comfortable with adaptations, or do we kind of want to stay true
Sure,
to the original?
sure.
I think adaptations are fine as long as you acknowledge that they're
Yes,
adaptations. I mean,
yeah.
I think that especially if we look at, we mentioned Disney before, everything Disney is an adaptation, right?
Yes.
All of them ended much more morbidly than
Yeah.
Thank you, Deborah, for taking us back to our villains and
I'm just
monsters.
saying,
The Brothers
people's eyes
Grimm.
got
Nobody
pulled
takes the
out.
Brothers Grimm.
Lion
and
King
use
is based on
those
Hamlet.
stories.
Well, you people
Exactly.
all love to talk all over each other. So you know what I'm going to
Sorry.
do? I'm going to stop the conversation and we're going to play a game.
Okay, great.
Here we go.
We're just excited.
We are handing out our dry erase boards so our contestants, because I did introduce you like contestants at the top of the show, can play our game. You've heard of HQ. This is our literary quotient. LQ, are you ready to play?
Yes.
go.
sort of.
Do I
Okay.
win $5,000?
No, you're
Like
not
on
going to win
HQ?
anything
There's no-
except
But not
bragging
really money.
rights.
And your respect.
And your respect. Here we go.
That would be
you can
new.
either answer with the letter or write the answer down. The first question: which one-legged pirate was the first man to instill fear in Captain Flint? Was it Captain Hook, Davy Jones, Captain Jack Sparrow, or Long John Silver? So, Hook, Jones, Sparrow, Silver. Show your answers. What do we have? We have Hook, we have Silver, we have Jones, we have Silver. It is Long John Silver. Very
Man,
good.
that just made me want some fried fish.
It's a good restaurant.
Second question. Yeah, Arthur Treacher. I'm worried that this side is really going to get this question right, so we'll try it anyway. You guys.
Oh, so you
work
have
on
no
this.
faith in us?
Well, you'll see why.
Watch me get it
Uncle
wrong.
Tom's Cabin villain, Simon Legree, makes a rather grand appearance in which Tony Award-winning Broadway musical? Some are writing before I even say it. Is it The Color Purple, Showboat, Bloody Bloody Andrew Jackson, or The King and I? Simon Legree becomes a character in which of these shows?
Can you read the choices again?
I can. The Color Purple, Showboat, Bloody Bloody Andrew Jackson, or The King and I?
I'm just gonna go with this.
And reveal. King and I, King and I, King and I, King and I. You are all correct.
See, you have
Simon
no faith
of
in us.
Legree. Okay, you ready for one more?
Yeah.
Of course.
Okay, thought to be a suicide, she and her lover were actually murdered by her son. Was it Ophelia, Mrs. Bates, Hedda Gabler, or Lady Macbeth?
Say it again, the beginning.
Thought to be a suicide, she and her lover were actually murdered by her son. Was it Ophelia, Mrs. Bates, Hedda Gabler, Lady Macbeth? Okay, ready to reveal? What have we got? We got a B, a C, and a C. This side got it right. It is Mrs. Bates.
Bates.
Norman
Yes.
Bates did it. Do you
I
want
thought
one
you
more?
said he was
You want one
Mrs.
more?
Bates.
He was a suicide.
Who?
I misunderstood. I thought you were saying that he died and her.
Thought to be a suicide, she and her
Oh, she and her
lover.
lover. I'm thinking of
We
the
are
son.
actresses. We don't often read or do things, so we won't know the answer.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, we're going to try one more with this panel. Here we go. Cruella de Vil's name is actually borrowed from another villainous character, Count de Vil, who is in fact the Devil, Jack the Ripper, Mr. Hyde, or Dracula.
And now I want to read all these books over again.
Cruella de Vil's name is actually borrowed from another villainous character, Count de Vil, who is in fact the Devil, Jack the Ripper, Mr. Hyde, or Dracula.
Oh,
Let's see.
no, I'm changing mine.
I think you're free to do that.
Make sure you erase completely.
Yeah, I did.
Okay, let's see. What do we got? Devil, and I lost my place. Jack the Ripper and Jack the Ripper. You're all wrong. It was Dracula.
I had Dracula.
That's what I had at first.
erased Dracula.
It's the note that's sent from for the real estate
Yes,
to buy
that's what I
the
thought. That's
place
what I
in
put
London.
down, and then I
It's
went,
Count
oh,
de Vil,
DeVille.
and that's where they stole it for.
Darn,
All right, you want one
darn,
more?
darn. Okay,
Yes.
let's redeem
I just like
myself.
this one because I like the
I
question.
think we're all tied up.
It's even more surprising that this villain would help catch the Tooth Fairy, since he himself enjoys sinking his teeth into human flesh. Is it Alfred Packard, Sebastian Venable, Hannibal Lecter, or Solomon Grundy? It's even more surprising that this villain would help catch the Tooth Fairy, since he himself enjoys sinking his teeth into human flesh. Packard, Venable, Lecter, Grundy.
I'm only sure of one cannibal, so I'm gonna go with that.
Well, I will tell you this before you turn around. All of them are cannibals.
Well,
So, who was the right cannibal? Turn them around. Hannibal. You two are wrong. It is Hannibal Lecter.
yes,
Deborah, we're not
we
going to
go.
win anything.
Nothing. We get nothing.
all the pride over here.
Well, they knew the musical question. At least they had that
Yes.
going for them. You know what that means, though? We're out of time. Oh, no. Evo's checking his watch. He's got places to go, people to save. So anyway, that brings this episode to it. Next week, we are talking about all things related to love. We'll be joined by young adult writer Caroline Leach and America's Got Talent's Christina Wells will be here. So thanks to Deborah and Christina. Thanks to Deborah and Evo
Thank you,
for
Ernie.
being here with us. Remember, thanks to the Houston Public Library for hosting us and inviting us into their confines to bring you this show. If you haven't voted for your book yet in the Great American Read, you can do it at pbs.org. And if you have any thoughts you want to share with us, #cover2cover. We'd love to see what you're reading and what you think about what we've been reading. Until next time, on behalf of Houston Public Media, I'm Ernie Manouse. Thank you for watching. Have a